Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here for the second session of the day for Nova Scotia Human Rights Week. For those who have been around, my name is Jeff Overmars. I'm a communications advisor at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and it's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's presenter. First, I would like to acknowledge that, albeit virtually, we're hosting this meeting in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Mi'kmaq people have made these lands their home since time immemorial. They are the past rather, and remain the future and current caretakers of this land. These lands are governed by the treaties of peace and friendship, and we hope that we're able to honor Mi'kmaq people through this session today. I want to acknowledge that the Commission values Mi'kmaq teachings such as Imsit Nugama, meaning all my relations, which honors and respects the interconnectivity, the inherent interconnectivity of all beings here in Mi'kma'ki. I would also like to acknowledge the deep contributions of people of African descent to the province and to advancing rights not only for individuals within their communities, but for all people in Nova Scotia. Despite decades and centuries even of oppression and disenfranchisement, people of African descent have come together to advance rights for all persons in Nova Scotia, including working to establish the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission itself, and had actually penned the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. And so the commission is deeply indebted to people of African descent and African Nova Scotians, and we hope to honor their work and legacies by continuing to advance dignity and rights for all Nova Scotians. I'll say briefly that we have ASL interpretation on this call today, and for folks that are wishing to spotlight the ASL interpreter, you can do so using your tools within the Zoom webinar. As well, you're able to turn on the closed captioning at any time using the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen. Also, along the bottom of the screen, you'll find a Q&A function. If you click that button, you can submit a question at any point throughout the presentation. We have allotted some time at the end of today's presentation to address any questions that may come in. So if throughout the presentation you've got a question and it's burning, drop it in the chat and rather the Q&A box, and Augie will get to that. And thank you, Augie Jones, Executive Director for the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs, for being here today to share with us a bit about the work of the office, and as well as just the ongoing pursuit to advance inclusion in Nova Scotia. So thank you very much, Augie, for being here.
You're welcome, Jeff. Thanks so much for the invitation to what I think is a really important week to discuss human rights. And I also want to thank Cindy for being here as well, because when we talk about human rights, obviously having an ASL interpreter is part of that same conversation. So Jeff, it's okay. I'm ready to share my screen. Are we good with that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Augie.
Okay. So thank you to everyone for taking some time out today. I'm looking very casual. We have a African Nova Scotian Affairs 2-day retreat happening. So I kind of came over on lunchtime in order to do this session. Jeff had reached out to me, months ago around doing this, and not only for myself personally, which will come to light once I start to share some of the slides, but more so for us at ANSA and my Deputy Minister, Tracy Thomas. This was important that whenever we have a chance to be in front of our government colleagues, we definitely, are excited about that time to make clear the work that we do. So I'm going to be sharing slides from 1 o'clock to 1:30. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. And even once we get to 1:30, feel free to unmute your mic and ask questions orally as well. So today's connection, I think, is twofold here. Is one, to talk about the work of ANSA, but before we do that, what's the connection of the Human Rights Commission and human rights in general to the work that the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs does. So when we think about the pursuit of greater inclusion, and semantically, there's many ways that we've looked at, equity, diversity, inclusion, civil rights, human rights, anti-discrimination, anti-racism. There's many words that we use, and hopefully in the next 30 minutes, there will be, hopefully a well-articulated connection as to why this conversation is always important, how diverse this conversation is, and then more importantly, historically, where does this conversation come from? And hopefully I present slides that make all of that clear. And as you see, obviously, you see a representation of a street sign in New Glasgow, where Viola Desmond, who is from Halifax, was traveling to Sydney, Cape Breton. She was an entrepreneur, and she was doing, traveling to do some work around her hair business and her cosmetology business, and stopped in New Glasgow. And most people know the story of just car broke down, wanted to go see a movie, and then some of the things that happened around that really are human rights issues, and we will get into that. So I just open up with a connection to Viola Desmond and Nova Scotia's storied history with human rights. So when we look at human rights, it's a pretty vast and can be a complicated conversation, but I'm a very much a common denominator person. So to me, it's from the time, you're on the earth as a human, you have rights. And when you leave your house as a human, you have rights. And I think those rights, many of them are depicted in this graphic, but rights of thought, rights of education, rights to assemble, rights for association, rights to move, rights to be safe, rights to be supported by the government, especially a government that you pay taxes to, right to speak your mind, right and access to information. And so when we talk about this, I want to be quite clear is that human rights is not just for people of African ancestry or African Nova Scotians or people of African descent. It's a holistic conversation around all humans. And so to frame this up, I think that when we think about where does this come from? So let's go back with hopefully an open mind and a data-driven objective viewpoint that what was colonialism? And what was government's role in colonialism? Because when we are working for government and we think about, and I'll get to this later, when many of the marginalized communities are asking and needing human rights commissions and needing government to advocate on behalf of them, there's a karmic reconciliation piece to that, because many of the anti-human rights things that have been structured in society have been based on governments doing it, and not this particular government, but governments from the 1700s, governments from the 1800s, governments from the early 1900s. And these are not emotional points I bring up. These are not what you might find to be made up situations. These are factual situations. And I for people that are familiar with the term Sankofa and the Sankofa bird, an African proverb, which the Sankofa bird, its feet are facing forward and its beak is facing backwards. And so in order for us to know the present and be able to move towards the future, we have to be unapologetically able to go back into the past and own the past and the reality of the past. So colonialism was set up by governments to leave Europe in particular and to go to other lands and exploit those lands. That's exactly what it was. So when we think about the beginnings of, the lands that they were going to, human beings lived there, and those human beings had rights. And so when those rights, for whatever reason, and again, this is many centuries ago, these rights were trampled upon, and that was part of colonialism. And so I do want to make quite clear is that as we're talking about changing society, oftentimes people who do not feel comfortable and have not felt comfortable in society and felt protected in society through their human rights are often the people looking for change. So when we talk about those with disabilities, we talk about obviously the Indigenous community, in particular the Mi'kmaq community here in Mi'kma'ki. When we talk about the African Nova Scotian community and those of African ancestry that came to Nova Scotia. When we talk about women in particular and the feminist movement wanting change. When we talk about newcomers coming to Nova Scotia, Canada, and wanting change. People that want change are not happy with their present conditions or their past conditions. And so when we look at colonialism, there were obviously people that benefited from colonialism and people that did not. And again, I'm trying to frame a past so that we can make clear, and this is a very Sankofa method of where we are in the present. We look at governments, who sat on governments, who ran governments, and look from all perspectives I just said. Were women allowed to be in government? Were women allowed to vote? Were people of color allowed to be in government? Were they allowed to vote? We know that there was a definite exclusion of those type of situations and laws, Jim Crow laws that said certain people can't go here and can't do that. So we have to own our history that we didn't have an inclusive history. We had an exclusive history. And so with that, there were certain people that got human rights and there were certain people that did not. And it was actually embedded in laws, embedded in country clubs, embedded in restaurants that certain people, whether it was disabilities, whether it was your sexuality, LGBTQ+, whether it was the color of your skin, whether it was your gender, we come from a past where not every human had rights. And we have to acknowledge that because that really makes clear why there are certain voices that are asking for rights because we do have a history of those people not having rights. And when we add prejudice, discrimination, and marginalization, we start to see a centuries-old pattern of some people benefiting, which means you get the best farming land. You get streets named after you. You have access to information, access to government money, access to funding. And so we can frame that a couple of ways. Look at the Black Loyalists, who in the late 1800s, as the British monarchy wanted to destabilize the slave economy in the Americas, said to Black people along the eastern seaboard, if you come to Nova Scotia, you are loyal, Black loyalists to Britain, and we're going to give you certain land and certain resources so you can thrive in Nova Scotia. Well, we know that didn't happen, and how I know that is look at the communities, the traditional African Nova Scotian communities that still exist. So North Preston, East Preston, Hammonds Plains, Upper Hammonds Plains, Lincolnville, Sunnyvale, Weymouth Falls, many of these communities that were seen as, hey, come here and we will reward you as Black loyalists, they're hard to get to in 2024. So if you think about in the 1800s, it takes me 45 minutes to drive from downtown Halifax to North Preston to the church in North Preston in 2024. So how far away was North Preston from the center of the where we call the city center, near the harbor, near industry in the 1800s? It was very far away. So that's not human rights. So people were brought here of African ancestry and put on land that was infertile, far from the harbor, and were not meant to prosper. That's a fact. Let's talk about Africville. I have my Africville Seaside jersey on today, which was a colored hockey league team. But we know in the history of Africville, these were Black people living in a strong community where people, they had a church. There was grocery store, there was stores and communities and a sense of togetherness. And these people paid taxes. And if you know the history of Africville, eventually it got bulldozed. Ironically, when it was flipped on them that, oh, well, you don't have the infrastructure. Well, it was the infrastructure that they paid taxes for, but didn't get. These are human rights issues. The legacy in Mi'kma'ki of Mi'kmaq people is a human rights industry, like the lack of human rights. People with disabilities who are still fighting for rights in Nova Scotia. And I just want to frame that because all of this comes from history. For me personally, I really come from a background. My father was Rocky Jones, who was a civil rights lawyer. My mother is Joan Jones, and you see a picture of them in 1978 here at a news conference. And this actual picture comes from the New York Times, because when my mom passed away, her biography and the obituary for my mother was in the New York Times, because she was born in Boston. And she migrated to Nova Scotia with my dad in the late 60s. So I have that picture because I grew up in a household where human rights was always on the table. And I want to bring a story about human rights and civil rights, and an epiphany that came to me at my dad's funeral, because both my dad and mom passed away. When you see the other picture, that's Angela Davis, who's a renowned, professor, PhD, and also Black Panther member. And this is her in 2018, when she was speaking at Dalhousie University, and my mother was alive at the time. And this isn't her first time meeting Angela Davis, but just to say, there's that intersectionality of Black women who were fighting for women's rights, but were also fighting for the rights of Black people. So a lot of the civil rights mechanisms that were brought to Nova Scotia, I know that my parents were part of many people, many Black people that were at the forefront of this. So when Jeff alludes to the Human Rights Commission having roots in African Nova Scotian community, that's the truth, because many of the ways that Black Americans were trying to change the American government and how it dealt with diversity and inclusion and equity, we borrowed those ways and brought them to Nova Scotia. So that led to the Black United Front in the early 70s, which a lot of governments didn't have those type of equity departments within them. But the Black United Front, and you can Google that, was a part of that movement. And so was setting up the Human Rights Commission. And likewise, so was setting up ANSA, which I will get to. So civil rights and human rights really go together. And I wanted to give one memory I had at my dad's funeral in Truro. I was at the funeral, and Noel Knockwood and Danny Paul were burning sweetgrass over my dad's casket. And there were people from the homeless community there. There were people from the criminal justice, men and women that were formerly incarcerated that were at his funeral. There were white people at his funeral. There were people with disabilities at his funeral. And as I was around as his oldest son, the amount of people that came up to me who were not Black people that said, wow, like your dad really helped us empower us to fight for our rights. And it's the first time that I realized that civil rights, which I always alluded to, Rosa Parks in the States and Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, I realized at the first time, and I'm an English teacher, and I didn't get the semantics of this, is civil rights is rights of the civilian, any civilian, that when they leave their household, they're supposed to be, in particular, protected by a government, whether it's a municipal government, a provincial government, or a federal government, to make sure that you are safe in your community. That's a civil right, a right of civilians, and it's a human right. And so I want to make those connections between civil rights and human rights, because this is Human Rights Awareness Week. So when we talk about ANSA, and I do want to go through this quickly, is from advocacy, this was created. So African Nova Scotian Affairs, it was a task force on government services by the Black community in September 1996. What came out of that was that we needed a department within government that would be able to be a bridge between the Black community, which was marginalized, and government. And so 4 years later, there was a commitment to say, yes, we do need an African Nova Scotian Affairs inside of government. You'll see in July 2021, the final report around how this was going to turn out and how it was going to look was established. And then if you look across to the right column, in 2003, the acting executive director was appointed, and a lot of credit goes to Wayne Hamilton, who was born in Beachville, Nova Scotia, who was he was the original executive director of African Nova Scotian Affairs, and he was on a 6-month contract, to be honest. And it ended up being that Wayne was here for over 20 years. And so the history of ANSA is connected to the Human Rights Commission. It's connected to advocacy by the Black community. And so just wanted to quickly go into that now when you think about 2005, we have an official website and logo, which I'll go into. And then Wayne was appointed full-time CEO, which became executive director of ANSA in 2025. So then as we reached out, our mandate is still provincial. So our Cape Breton office was opened in 2007. And that, consisted of Lillian Marsman, Chantal Reed Demeter, and Brandy Shannon. For many years, that was the one office. And the main staff that Wayne had was centered in Halifax. You see that there's a Yarmouth office, which opens in 2019, which is 12 years after the first office. Truro office opens in 2019. And when Dwayne Provo was our first associate deputy minister, there were many offices that he facilitated being opened. So Digby, New Glasgow, and Preston were opened in 2022, which is actually, if you think about it, it's yesterday. And even more of something that's recent past is our present deputy minister was named the associate deputy minister of ANSA in October 2023. And in June 2024, Deputy Thomas was named not only the Deputy Minister of ANSA, but she was also named the Deputy Minister of the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism Initiatives. So just wanted to link that history into the present offices that we have. Very quickly, I wanted to look at the logo real quick because this does have a history. And I want you to really focus in on this logo for a second, because logos like the Nike logo and many of the private enterprise logos mean something. Well, this logo means something as well. And so firstly, the first image is actually a Mayflower, because similar to two-eyed seeing that the Mi'kmaq community used, we have to meld our African Nova Scotian community in the fact that we grew up in Nova Scotia, in New Scotland. So bagpipes, they resonate with me. I've always heard bagpipes in my life. That's just part of being African Nova Scotian. So if you look at the logo, it's a Mayflower, which is the official flower of Nova Scotia. That's part of the image. If you look at the star in the middle, that's a purposeful star with spokes coming out of it, which represents the star nature that we see ourselves internally as people of African descent. Because when we were put on those lands that were infertile and away from commerce and away from basically not set up to prosper, we still survived, we were resilient, and 400 years later, we still exist and we're looking to still thrive. So that star spoke thing to us internally is talking about our own resilience and brilliance. And then the birds on the outside represent ancestors, transcendence, and the ability to do anything you can dream of. So the Mayflower, the stars, the spokes, and the birds are all connected to that ANSA logo. Across from a Canadian national point of view, ANSA is the only government office in Canada dedicated to addressing the unique needs of provincial citizens of African ancestry. So there's no African Nova Scotian equivalent in Quebec or Ontario or British Columbia or Alberta. That doesn't exist. But that 400-year history is different than the people of African ancestry that emigrated or migrated to Montreal, migrated to Toronto, migrated to Calgary, migrated to Vancouver. That's not the history that I already went into. So one of the things I do know from having the African Canadian Services branch in education, from having an Office of Equity and Anti-Racism Initiatives, of having an African Nova Scotian Affairs office, these are all things that are unique to Nova Scotia. And where we can say, if we give a check mark to the Nova Scotian government, these are positions that have been embedded in government. So this is unique to Canada. And I'm not one to read text. I know I have probably about another 5 to 8 minutes, and then I'll open up to questions. But I would say that, basically, we're here to support the African Nova Scotian community. And now that mandate has expanded to not only the historical African Nova Scotian community of those that have been here for 400 years, but we have a strong mandate, which we have to improve on, around anyone of African ancestry who's in Nova Scotia paying taxes. And as we know, as immigration grows, so does immigration from Africa, from the continent, from the Caribbean, people of African ancestry coming from America, coming from Toronto. So we recognize that there's probably more than 10,000 people who live in Nova Scotia who aren't from traditional African Nova Scotian communities. And that is also still part of it. Those people are still part of our mandate at ANSA. In our mandate, and I'm not going to go through this too slowly, is obviously to advocate to create and market and promote the African Nova Scotian culture, but also the culture of those of African descent. Those two cultures are intersectional. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also differences. And so we try to be a part of supporting the Jamaican Canadian Association, the Nigerian Association, but also the Black Cultural Center, the Black Loyalist Heritage Center. So we are trying to expand ourselves to be able to be that government spot for all people of African ancestry or African descent. We obviously collaborate as we're doing today. One of the reasons I took lunchtime to come to do this session is so I'm able to collaborate with my colleagues and share information within government. And obviously we represent, what we may call loosely the Black community in Nova Scotia. So ANSA is very much, this is our mandate. And it really doesn't change with governments. It gets tweaked with governments. Most governments align with this anyway. But we do have a mandate that is something that is rooted in the original creation of ANSA, and we're well aware of that mandate. Our structure, and this is just a quick information for those people that don't know ANSA. Obviously, I alluded to Tracy Thomas being our deputy minister, and we have 4 distinct yet connected units. So community and government relations, research and planning, which is our data team, and our corporate services and operations side of ANSA. I'm the executive director of those 3 units. And Lauren Grant is our executive director of land titles. So land titles started in ANSA. It moved to the Office of Anti-Racism Initiatives at a point, and now it's back with ANSA. And so land titles initiative is dealing with 5 African Nova Scotian communities in order to get those people deeds to their land. Similar to Africville, these are people that have been paying taxes, but have never had deeds to their land. So at this point, over the last 3 years, over 400 African Nova Scotian people have gotten title and deed to their land who have not had that. And so the Land Titles Initiative is part of what we do at African Nova Scotian Affairs. Lastly, I'll just talk about our provincial reach. This is a map that was done by Manfred Egbe, who's our director of research and planning, or our data lead. And it shows the 52 African Nova Scotian communities. And what I alluded to is wherever you see a town in Nova Scotia, there's a Black community that's on the margins. It doesn't matter, it's on the margin of Adigonish, on the margins of Windsor, on the margins of Digby, on the margins of Truro. And Truro would be different because the island and the marsh and Bible Hill are kind of more in the center of town. But the majority of these yellow dots that you see are on the peripheries of Nova Scotia towns. And so as we expanded ANSA and we wanted to be in more spaces, we created the program administrator officers. And they are actually our regional satellite offices so that we're close to the communities that are outside of HRM. And so the way that we did that was looking at this map, we said, okay, where do we need to make sure that our offices are close to African Nova Scotian populations? And so if you look at the blue area to the very right, Chantal Reed Demeter is our PAO, and she's sectioned in Sydney because Whitney Pier is in Sydney. Glace Bay also has a strong Black community, so we put the office there. When we look at the next area moving to the left, in the northeastern region, Crystal States her office is in New Glasgow, yet her reach is at Adigonish, and it's Guysborough, all the way actually to the Causeway, to Mulgrave. And that's a long scope for her to have. But again, we have pockets of African Nova Scotian communities there that she is in charge of, or she's the bridge to ANSA. Andrew Paris is our northern PAO, and his office is in Truro, but yet his scope is from Amherst, kind of into East Hants, but definitely between Amherst, the Black community in Amherst, and Truro. We then go to the top where you see southwestern Annapolis. Brenda Francis is in Digby. Digby with communities like Conway, Acaciaville, Jordantown, Weymouth Falls is actually the largest African Nova Scotian population outside of HRM. So Brenda is stationed at NSCC in Digby, yet her scope is all the way to Windsor and Kentville and New Minas. That is her scope. On the other side of the South Shore is Troy Lawrence, who is in Yarmouth, and his scope goes from Yarmouth basically to Bridgewater. And then within HRM, which has the largest population of people of African ancestry, Rhonda Johnson is Dartmouth / the Prestons. Her office is in North Preston. And Brandy Shannon is our Halifax rep, or PAO, and her office is here with us. This would be, and of course people can take screenshots, but this would be the contacts for these people. So it's very important that we have community connections, and these PAOs build trust in community. So not only does community send intel up through them, but we are also able to have other government departments who are saying, hey, we've got a program in health. We have a program in community services. We have a program in public works. We would like to access the African Nova Scotian community authentically. We have the ability to garner the knowledge and expertise of our PAOs in order to make that happen. That's a good date to come in. That's not a good date to come in. That's a good date to hold your information session. This is not a good venue. This is not a good venue. So we want to be that hub of African Nova Scotian and people of African descent. We want to be that hub for people to come ask questions. If it's within ANSA and community, culture, tourism, and heritage, we will take care of it. If it's not within our lane, we will definitely refer people to where they can get answers to their questions. So as you can see from the last graphic, the way forward for us is we would like to be that within government and connecting to the external community, that one stop for consultation. So we are I'm 3 minutes over. So it's 1:33, and I will just leave you, and we're all within government. We can get each other through Microsoft Teams. This is actually a slide that we use externally, but you can get ANSA generally at ansa@novascotia.ca. You can get me as executive director at Augie Jones at novascotia.ca, and that's our toll-free number there. So I will stop sharing, and that leaves 15 minutes. I see that there's 2 questions in the Q&A, which I will take a look at. I see Nada has a question. And then I'm trying to look for the second question. That's an easy one. The Colored Hockey League was in the Maritimes. This is actually done by a Nigerian guy who lives in Toronto. So he has these hockey type jerseys for the Africville Seasides, for the Truro Victorias, and there's one other team in the Black Hockey League that he has a jersey for. And I forget, I'll put in the chat his, I think it's Clutch 85 is his company, and he does jerseys in particular, but he's very much interested. So this is a side African Nova's Pan-African colors, and then this is the Scotian flag, the logo or emblem. So it's very much from the Colored Hockey League. Nada, I'm reading, that's a lot of the question. I think, Nada, the way I closed up, I think it's, if there is research that you would like to do, I think that it's important to reach out to ANSA, and we can facilitate that and give some, and the Indigenous community does this as well, is what is the most genuine, trauma-informed, authentic way to garner data from our community. Because when you look at many of the data sources, African Nova Scotian and Indigenous folks don't feel comfortable to fill out and give research and data about their lives, and partly because of the historic timeline that I talked about. So we can really help with that at ANSA. And so if anything, now just get in touch with me at ANSA, and I can get you in touch with Colin Campbell, who is our head of government and community relations, and he will definitely help you navigate that. And also Manfred Egbe, who I alluded to, who was with Department of Community Services. He's now with ANSA. He is our data specialist, and he would also be able to help with that. So, Jeff, I am open to a lot of the other questions or comments, and I really appreciate the positive feedback. But if there's anyone that wanted to unmute, I don't know if with the panel set up, they're allowed to.
Yeah, the way that the webinar is set up is that it does ask to have the questions submitted via the Q&A in text. So if any folks are thinking of questions to submit, I'd encourage them to please drop it in the Q&A just now. I wanted to take a moment, Augie, just to highlight the fact that a webinar is taking place tomorrow as part of Nova Scotia Human Rights Week that does invite some folks, community navigators from ANSA working in the Land Titles Initiative, together with Curtis Weil and Sunday Miller from Acoma Holdings. They're going to be speaking about the Land Titles Initiative, the work that's been done on the Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust, and the work that Acoma Holding is doing as well. So it should be a really great discussion. It's going to be 90 minutes, so a little bit longer, and taking place tomorrow. So any folks that haven't yet registered for that one, there's still opportunity to do that.
I do see two more questions. Oh yeah, he has. Yeah, Chatham All Stars, though, Nicholas, is a baseball team out of Ontario. So I'm looking. What are the barriers encountered in the quality education? Well, okay, that's a large question, Zoe. And I did work in education for over 20 years. So I taught high school English. I developed curriculum, African Heritage Literature course for grade 12. I also worked at African Canadian Services Branch. So I think that there's a lot of a discussion around education, and it'd be tough for me to do it to talk about it in a short amount of time. But I guess, more than anything, if I could pinpoint, is the perception that education and teachers and principals had of Black students. And so when traditionally, and there was a Black report that you can look up, BLAC, which is the Black Learners Advisory Council of 1994. And it's a 3-volume excellent research document on Black education. And of course, it's decades old now, but some of it, a lot of the information on it still resonates around lack of curriculum, lack of Black teachers, lack of Black administrators, students being put on individual program plans because of behavior rather than diagnosed learning disabilities. Not having connections with parents. I mean, there's a lot of issues that would come up around when you look at the data of numeracy and literacy rates traditionally for students of historical African Nova Scotian communities. The literacy and numeracy rates are very low. And so for over the last 30 years, there's really been an attempt to try to improve that gap. We called it the achievement gap. We've tried to do that, and we are making some progress, but I would say that the same achievement gap is also mirrored in the Indigenous community as well. Does ANSA offer any training opportunities? Yeah, we do. Dave, reach out to me, and I can email you back. I know that the aforementioned Wayne Hamilton does sessions within government around African Nova Scotian history, and I know that Deputy Thomas can really probably talk to the corresponding deputy to make sure that happened. So we do have those opportunities. Obviously, mine was just a half an hour snippet.
Just to let you know too, Augie, there are people participating that are outside of government. So if there are other resources that would be accessible to those outside government as well, they could find those via your website.
Yeah, they can. Yes, and thanks for that, Jeff. Um, and Teresa, I think that how can you contribute as an organization? I think get in touch, Teresa. I mean, a lot of this, to be honest, people is relational, and that's one of my main things around whatever we deem as equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's actually relations. So if you want to know more about people who are Arabic, get to know people who are Arabic. If you want to know more about the Indigenous community, make relationships with the Indigenous community. If you want to know more about people in the LGBTQ plus community or disabilities community, and you see where I'm going with this, at the center core of that is relational. And so I think that if anyone out there feels like, you want to know what, I feel this empowered me, I feel like there's something that I want to do around this, please get in touch with ANSA. We're very relational. I think that is part of our job, is to be open to any type of inquiry, any question, so that people can get to know more. And then Karen. Yeah, Karen, same thing, and we can help you with that. We are also within community culture, tourism, and heritage, making a concerted, purposeful effort to get art, Indigenous art, African Nova Scotian art from newcomers to put up. Because again, if you look at government offices 50, 60 years ago, there was certain art that was up and certain art that was not. And I think there's a definite movement to change that. So if you get in touch with me, Karen, or with ANSA, we would be able to help you with that. And Dave, you're very welcome. I'll be looking forward to your email.
One last plug, Augie, just to say, if folks are trying to submit questions via the chat, that won't work. You would have to click the Q&A button and type your question into the Q&A button.
Oh yeah, because now I'm totally confused because I'm in answered and I see that there's other. This is one. What anti-racisms are available in the province? Where can we learn more about it? I think, Nicholas, the Office of Anti-Racism Initiatives is part of it. I would say to everyone on the call this is the YouTube AI. You don't need an encyclopedia set anymore. I remember in junior high in the 80s, any family that had an encyclopedia set got the highest marks in grade 7 geography because you could photocopy, right? We're not at that age anymore. So knowledge is out there. I think that if you're curious, obviously ANSA's there. The Office of Anti-Racism Initiatives is there. But I do know that a lot of the stuff I spoke of, from Rocky Jones to Joan Jones to Africville to North Preston, like you can Google that and get a lot of that information. So I don't want to dismiss that, but in the short amount of time I have, I can only hopefully I got some questions answered. But if you are curious, there's a lot of things that would come from that you'd have to look up, and really at this time and age, you put something into Google and they will lead you right to some type of video or article or discussion blog that deals with the question. And I love too the question in particular, just the question to be curious, because I will tell you that for me as an African Nova Scotian, I'm curious about Indigenous life. I'm curious about the life of those who are LGBTQ plus and transgendered, and what life are they living. I'm curious, as I have male privilege, of what gaps do I have, which is many blind spots as a male that women don't have in their marginalization. So being curious is I think the starting point of building those relationships. And so I really applaud people that leave this feeling curious, and please be open to be curious. There's things that I've been curious about with the Indigenous community that I said the wrong thing and I stepped in the wrong thing, but I'm unapologetic about, sorry about that, I was just curious, and so please, foster your curiosity, build relationships, and it's okay to be wrong and use the wrong pronoun, but apologize for it and say you're trying. Work with the Black community and say, I might have done that wrong, but I'm just here to try to learn. Like, I think that we also have to open up spaces for people to come into our culture and be in a safe space to learn about it. And I think in 2024, that's happening more and more and more. I have to be 360 curious. So if I want people to be curious about being African Nova Scotian, I also have to be curious about everyone else out there in order to even this out. Now, Europe, I know a lot about Europe because in order for me to graduate grade 12, I had to know a lot about Europe. So I know a lot about Europe. So I have to be honest, my curiosity may go a little bit beyond that. But little to say, if I could close up, I think being relational and being positively curious are two great seeds to start with.
Augie, you've crammed so much into this 45 minutes. I'm so grateful for all that you've presented on and the incitement for curiosity and humility and the opportunities to try and not be afraid to make mistakes as we all continue to learn on this journey that we are on. I did want to flag for Nicholas, who was asking about anti-racism initiatives. Yesterday, we recorded a session with the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism talking about their work in community as well. So they can find a recording for that on the Commission's website as well. And Augie, thank you for all the information, and folks can connect with you via ANSA's website. And the recording from this session will be available within 24 hours. And I'd encourage folks to look back at that calendar of events for the rest of Nova Scotia Human Rights Week, and please sign up to attend and kind of feed that curiosity and keep learning.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And Cindy, thank you so much for adding to the diversity of this discussion. And thanks to all the people that took their time because you didn't have to do this. So thank you so much for your time to listen for 45 minutes. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Augie. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.